So an offshoot of the CGCT project for Curriculum Studies 488 at Depaul, I decided to analyze and have my students analyze really how well were we doing at Niles North. How well is the math education at Niles North, and how can we compare that to other schools? So I created a graphs project for my high school students in Algebra 2. It's a regular course. Students are not in honors or advanced. And I asked them these two questions. How does the math education at Niles North compare to the math education of other schools in the state of Illinois? And what are your viable suggestions to improve mathematics education at Niles North? So when talking with my principal Dr. McTagg, he said it would be very interesting to see what would happen if our students made our suggestions to us. How can we get our students involved in this process? So the role and the purpose was for students to analyze the aforementioned questions and provide viable suggestions for improving future education at Niles North. We decided that this was a great way to get our students invested in what they were learning. So the actual audience for this project will be the Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Nancy Angata, if she can be available, but 100% for sure, Principal of Niles North, Dr. McTagg, and other district leaders, possibly the math directors at Niles North. So the situation is we want students to investigate their own education based on the percentage of students that meet or exceed state standards, college readiness, percentage of low income, student characteristics such as race, attendance, dropout, graduation, per pupil expenditure, and achievement gaps. Students will be evaluated on a presentation to Principal McTagg based on the following ideas. Underneath communication, the key question will be, is the presentation provided in the form of a convincing argument that is easy to understand? Under precision, is the presentation precise, logical, and free of errors and omissions? For sense-making, is the presentation logically connected to the problem? And the non-cognitive area of this project is perseverance. Did the student independently solve problems in their entirety without coaxing or major assistance? All four of these categories will also be developed in a student rubric that students will grade each other on as part of their group. There are four categories: excels, proficient, basic, and beginning. As far as grading for students, located at the bottom here are these ideas. How I will grade the students is based on proficient, near proficient, elements of proficient, and beginning. Let's just highlight this idea. If all four elements are proficient, or at least proficient, or they may have one developing category so long as another category is in the excels, they go above and beyond, students will earn an A. So this gives a lot of opportunities for students to earn A's. Let's look at the bottom, D for beginning. Most of the categories are beginning. Not more than one has no evidence. So the opportunity or the ability for a student to actually get a D or a passing grade is actually very high and actually pretty unlikely. Most students will end up in this A, B, or C range, which I think will help them build a lot of confidence in this project as well. So let's take a look at some of the data. All the data for the state of Illinois was recorded into a data in motion chart using Google Documents. And what ended up happening, we used Google Docs and Google Spreadsheets to allow the students to create data in motion graphs. This particular data in motion graph shows every school in the state of Illinois, every high school in the state of Illinois, with their AYP, annual yearly progress, versus their low-income students. Students were asked to talk about what happens as there's more low-income students in comparison to the annual yearly progress over here. Watch the chart. So what the students noticed was that there was definitely a general trend between low income and overall meets and exceeds. They noticed that this trend appeared to be linear and that there were some outliers such as Northside College Prep, Peyton, Young Magnet, Jones, Lane Tech, Lindblom, which were all Chicago schools that were selective enrollment. They also noted that many of these Chicago schools over here were low-income schools and their overall AYP was very low. This particular graph was developed by Mr. David Wartowski, the director of Niles North, and myself. This wonderful gentleman. So he and I collaborated using the IRC, the Illinois Interactive Report Card, to create this information for our students and allow them to analyze this, which they have. We also created a gadget for 30 to 40% low-income students, as shown here. Now we have schools that are comparable to the schools at Niles North. So they were able to see the actual comparison of schools at Niles North and understand what's happening of schools that related to them and see that there is still a trend that occurs. One major thing that they noticed at all of these schools is that the low income has increased from 2001 to 2010. Now, the last data that was actually given to students is based on instructional expenditure per year of schools that relate to Niles North and the surrounding area and their overall AYP versus low income. The darker a school in terms of red or orange or yellow means the more that they spend on students. The lower, the cooler the color, indicates the less that they spend. Students wanted to see a trend in which the more you spend, the better the students do. As we watch what happens, we notice the data scatters all over the place and low income has increased in these schools. What's interesting to know is, relatively speaking, the more schools spend, the better the students are doing. An outlier, Princeton High School. Another outlier, Armstrong High School, Marengo High School. We talked about why we should we investigate these schools or how do they compare. Princeton, for example, is a relatively small school and their variance really changes and they would actually spend less because their teachers there make less. The actual instruction expenditure would be less because of their teachers. So we talked about them as an outlier and students developed ideas based on that. So, an example of a student presentation so far in terms of AYP and low income is shown here. Students developed data tables with 4 schools, Niles North being one, Wheeling, Pekin, and Maine West. They felt that these were comparable schools and they developed equations for them and analyzed these equations. What they noticed was at all of these schools, the correlation coefficient being close to 1 indicates a strong correlation of data. Niles North, Wheeling, Pekin, and Maine West all had a very strong correlation to students that were becoming low income per year. What we were really interested in is the comparison of AYP to low income. So for Maine West, while they're showing growth in annual yearly progress versus the increase in low income students, their data really doesn't show any increase and decrease. There really is a weak correlation on that data. So what it's suggesting is that low-income students haven't impacted Maine West like they have in the state. At Pekin, for instance, there is a negative correlation, but it's a relatively weak, relatively strong correlation at negative 0.5. At Wheeling, however, there is growth as they improve, or as the low-income students increase. There is a strong correlation that they're doing better. In comparison, Niles North, there is a decrease, but it's a weak correlation. Niles North and Maine West have very similar populations. They're relatively close to each other, and they do spend vast amounts of money on their students. So our students analyze, hey, what's happening in Wheeling? So the current suggestion that students have right now is to analyze. So what we're asking our students to do is develop a viable suggestion. Students have looked at the data between Niles North and Wheeling, and they're looking at a comparison. And what they've noticed throughout time, as they watch these graphs, my strongest group has suggested, hey, Wheeling is showing some strengths. Their data says that they are showing some growth, even though that their low income has changed. And while Wheeling has varied throughout time, one thing that we notice about Wheeling is growth. And Niles North wants the same growth or better growth that Wheeling is. So my students so far have suggested that we need to analyze what's happening at Wheeling. We should send, their suggestion is, we should send students, we should send teachers, we should send administrators to Wheeling to analyze their programs and analyze what they're doing. We need to analyze them to see how we can get better. So my groups are really analyzing this and they're looking at it. The great thing that's coming about from this is students are developing their own graphs like this one here. Students are looking at not just AYP and low income, but attendance, race, graduation rates, chronic truancy, to really analyze what's happening and how we can compare ourselves with other schools in the state, other data trends using the IIRC, and how we can get better and how we can compare ourselves. What I like about this project and what I like about this in particular is it adds value for the students. It creates value for them to be better, to better understand, to understand how these relate to functions, domain, range, linear models, linear trends, and the correlation coefficient, to say how strong or how weak is our data and be able to present this in a viable fashion.